Well, it's kind of a new one for me to be here with you for 2 weeks in a row. Last week, my wife wasn't with me because she was in Oregon, and she got a nice surprise. And when she got home, she found out that she had been made an official Little Creeker. And she wanted to tell you she appreciates her T-shirt very much. All right. We want to start today by reading words of Scripture, the same Scripture reading that we had last week. It's from the Psalms, but it's kind of the anchor text for what we've been talking about last week, and we'll talk about again this week. Since my youth, God, in fact, let's read it out loud together, okay? Since my youth, God, you have taught me, and to this day I declare your marvelous deeds. Even when I am old and gray, do not forsake me, my God, until I declare your power to the next generation, your mighty acts to all who are to come. All right. We noticed last week that the person speaking here wanted God to be with them when they were old and gray, but it wasn't for himself. It was so that he could pass on the faith to the next generation. Well, today we're going to talk about finishing well. All right? We started strong last week. This week we're going to talk about finishing well. Old and gray is common to every one of us. And sometimes we wonder, well, is that a good thing or a bad thing? And so I want to talk a bit about that today, and we're going to talk about how to finish well. I was thinking about a formula for aging, and here's what I came up with. Age equals experience plus deterioration. All right? Age is experience plus deterioration. And that's basically what it is. And when you go through scriptures, you will find that there's a certain ambivalence about it. And I want to walk you through that for a moment. Experience. Now, that's a very good thing. And in the Bible, it is to be honored and respected. God's plan was for us to revere those who age. All right? Leviticus has this to say. It says, rise in the presence of the aged. Show respect for the elderly and revere your God. I am the Lord. All right? I'll tell you something you probably didn't know. In our society, we worship youth, not age. Youth. Not age. A friend of mine had this experience when he was 74 years old. He was at the Dallas airport. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the Dallas airport, but at the Dallas airport there is this light rail that's in an oval that goes up over the top of the airport, and you can get on this rail and you can ride from one concourse to the next. Well, my friend, 74 years old, was at Dallas, and so he went up and he got on the light rail, and it was packed full of people. And so he had to stand up and hold on to the overhead rail. And as the rail started, he noticed sitting in a seat right in front of him was a very beautiful co-ed. She had a University of Texas t-shirt on, and he thought, wow, what a beautiful young woman. Pretty soon, though, he noticed that she was looking at him. And he thought, I still got it. Even at 74 years old, I can attract the young ladies. Pretty soon, they made eye contact, and she spoke to him. And she said, Sir, would you like my seat? I'll get it up and give it to you if you would like. And he says, no, I'm doing just fine. And she says, well, my parents always taught me to get up and to give my seat to the aged. That kind of deflated his ego a little bit there, okay? Yeah, but her parents evidently had read Leviticus, right? Rise in the presence of the aged. We have articles, you can read them in all kinds of magazines, about anti-aging resources. But I want you to know the Bible is pretty much pro-aging. The word elder is used in the Bible about 175 times, and particularly in the Old Testament, it speaks how years can bring maturity and enable older folks to come alongside as a mentor, a guide to cheer along the younger generation, which is what we talked about last week. And therefore, elders in the community, the elderly in the community, the older people in the community are to be prized. And that's crucial. And a lot of reflections about this in Scripture. Here's a text you've probably never noticed before in the book of Leviticus. And here's what it says. If anyone makes a special vow to dedicate persons to the Lord by giving equivalent value, let the amount be set for a male between the ages of 20 and 60 at 50 shekels of silver. If he is a person 60 years or more, set the value at 15 shekels. Thus is born the idea of a senior citizen's discount. Okay? Right there in the Scriptures. You probably never noticed that before. The senior citizen's discount is actually a biblical concept. All right? The Bible does not make a secret of people's ages. Old age is viewed as a prize. For instance, it says of Abraham, Abraham died at a good old age, an old man full of years. The older people got, the more respected they were. And that's how God's community, God's church, is supposed to work. In fact, rabbis would teach on the Book of Exodus, and we still have one of their commentaries, and here's what the rabbis said. They said, how welcome is old age. The aged are beloved by God. Okay? In our day, you don't see that in ads very often. Very seldom do you see an ad in a glossy magazine that says, welcome to old age. One of the few places you see it is AARP, right? AARP, when you turn 50, you get your first solicitation from AARP. And the president of AARP says that the number one reaction of 50 years old who get their solicitation is, hey, what you sending it to me for? I'm not old. I'm not even close to retirement. He says they get mad. That's the number one reaction. Okay? Why? Because our society loves youth, not age. But human aging, which involves experience, that's really good. But since the fall, it also involves a kind of deterioration. And one of the most colorful passages in Scriptures that deal with that is from the Book of Ecclesiastes. And here's what the writer says. He says, remember your Creator in the days of your youth. In other words, he says, those of you that are young, start thinking now about finishing well. Okay? Remember your Creator in the days of your youth, before the days of trouble come and the years approach, when you say, I find no pleasure in them. And then there's this very colorful description of the days of trouble that are headed your way and my way. It says this, when the keepers of the house tremble and the strong men stoop. When age comes, we lose a little height. I know about that. I used to be 6'5". Okay? Probably shouldn't lie in church. Okay. Yeah. But yeah, we lose a little height. Our strength goes down. In fact, one way to tell if you're aging, in fact, let's do a little experiment here this morning. Would everybody stand up. Would you stand up with me for a moment? All right. If when you stood up, you heard a little creak, a snap, a crackle, or a pop, you're aging. Kids don't do that when they stand up, do they? Okay, sit back down. Now, if when you sit back down, you heard a noise, your aging is kind of progressing. Okay? Yeah. The writer goes on to say, all of this under the deterioration category. When the keepers of the house tremble and the strong man stoop, when the grinders cease because they are few. What's he talking about? Our teeth. Our teeth. See, no dentist back in those days, no dentures. You age and you start losing your teeth. And those looking through the windows grow dim. What's he talking about? Our eyesight. Yeah. No prescription glasses, no contact lenses, no laser surgeries, no cataract surgeries back in those days. Goes on. When the men rise up at the sound of the birds. What's that talking about? When you're older, you don't sleep as well as you used to anymore. Least little sound wakes you up. I got a friend who is 84, and he complains. He says, I've got 2 mockingbirds that live outside of my bedroom window, and I hate those things. They wake me up every morning. The only person I ever knew that didn't like to hear birds sing, okay? But yeah, he doesn't like them because they wake him up. When men rise up at the sound of the birds, but all their sounds grow faint. What's happening? We're losing our hearing. No hearing aids back in those days. When the almond tree starts to blossom. Anybody got an idea what color almond blossoms are? Anybody know? They're white. Almond blossoms are white. What's he saying? Our hair starts to change color. Turns from its original color to white or gray. And then I love this next metaphor, and he says, and the grasshopper drags himself along. Don't you love that metaphor? You see, you used to have a spring in your step. Now, you just kind of drag along. Okay? Grasshopper is a grass dragger now. Okay? Yeah. And he goes on, and desire is no longer stirred. No Cialis, no Viagra in those days. Then it gives this conclusion. Then man goes to his eternal home, and mourners go about the streets. Remember him, remember God, before the silver cord is severed, or the golden bowl is broken, before the pitcher is shattered, and at the spring, or the wheel broken at the well, and the dust returns to the ground it came from, and the spirit returns to the God who gave it. You see, folks, that's the day of trouble. The aging of the body is actually a syndrome. And if you would talk to people who study, gerontologists who study aging, they will tell you that the effects of aging on the body are deleterious, they are progressive, they are universal, and they are irreversible. Boy, that's a cheery thought, isn't it? Yeah. Your skin starts to sag. It loses its elasticity. You look at your hands and realize you're looking at your parents' hands. Hair starts to grow where you don't want it to, and it quits growing where you do. Weight for us men, leaves the poles and heads down towards the equator. Some of you, I know, are young and vigorous, and you're thinking, it'll never happen to me. And those of us that are older, we want you to know, we understand. We love you, but it is going to happen to you. In fact, we're kind of looking forward to it. In fact, it has already started. This is pretty amazing. I read this week. When you are in the embryonic stage, you're still in the womb, the human brain begins to develop, and it begins to develop at the rate of 50,000 nerve cells per second. The psalmist says that we are fearfully and wonderfully made, and that is exactly true. But then we start dying. Do you know how many of your brain cells have died? More than half of all of your brain cells died before you were even born. In other words, you started getting dumber before you ever had a chance to get smarter. And all of that raises the question for us this morning: how do we age well? And there's a lot that's been written about this, about successful aging, about optimal aging. How do you age well? But we're going to look at it this morning from a biblical perspective, because it's going to be different. According to the Bible, you and I were created to be eternal creatures. And I'll tell you one reason why that's so important for us to consider. In fact, it is more important for us to consider today than ever in the history of humankind. It's more important now than ever in the history of the church. This is from a church historian by the name of Martin Marty. If you don't mind, turn to the person that's sitting next to you and give them your best guess as to what the life expectancy was for a person living in the day of Christ in ancient Rome. Okay? Just turn to the person next to you, give them your best shot at it. How long do you think the average person lived in ancient Rome? All right, you got it? Once again, my source for this is Martin Marty. He says, as best they can guesstimate, the average lifespan of a person living in ancient Rome was 20. One of the reasons for that is that over half of all babies born did not live through the first year. Okay? We think about this because we've talked about sometimes at Christmas time about Mary must have married Joseph. He must have been an older man because you don't hear from him again after Jesus turns 12. Not necessarily. With the average lifespan of only 20, Joseph probably died young. Okay? 1,500 years later, medieval Europe. Average lifespan, 30 to 33. During the Middle Ages in Europe, there was a plague that went through Europe twice in 50 years, and each time it killed a third of the population of Europe. Wow. 30 to 33. Even as recently as 1800s United States, the average lifespan was only 36. Okay? Today, the average lifespan for men and women in the United States today is 77 for men, 81 for women. All right? See why I'm saying aging well is becoming more important than ever before in the history of the world? All right? So how do we age well? And I'm talking from a biblical perspective. It's different from what the world teaches. If you look at what society... Go back. 25 to 33% of all persons who have ever reached 60 are still alive today. That's the reason it's important to talk about aging well, because 25 to 33% of everybody who's ever reached 60 is still alive, still walking the planet. Wow. Okay, now, get back. How do we age well? Well, from society. Society thinks this. It says, here's what you need to age well. Society will tell you that you need freedom, you need independence, you need security, and you need comfort. Read AARP magazine, and that's what they'll tell you. That's what you need to age well as a senior. But that's not what the Bible says. The Bible, in fact, gives you a recipe for aging well, and the Bible says you need 3 things. Number 1, you need a wholehearted faith. I need the subtle conviction that I can trust God with my tomorrow, not because tomorrow will be easy, but because God is already there waiting for me. I want us to take a look at a guy in the Bible by the name of Caleb. Caleb, some of you will remember, was one of the 12 spies that were sent out to reconnoiter the promised land. All right? He went with 11 other guys. 10 of them came back and they said, let's go back to Egypt and be slaves. This assignment is impossible. We can't do it. Caleb and Joshua came back and they said, we can surely do it. All right? Because of the unbelief of most of the Israelites, Caleb had to spend the next 40 years wandering in the wilderness. He was 40 when he became a scout. By the time he crosses over the Jordan River, he's 80 years old, and another 5 years passes, and this is what Caleb says. He says, I was 40 when Moses sent me from Kadesh Barnea to explore the land. And I brought him back a report according to my convictions, but my brothers who went up with me made the hearts of the people melt with fear. I, however, followed the Lord my God wholeheartedly. By the way, did you know that if you have a negative attitude and a small faith when you are 40, there's a good chance you will not have those when you're 85. You want to know why? Here's a study. There's a psychologist by the name of Martin, how do you say that last name? Seligman? All right, Martin Seligman. He studied several hundred people in a religious community, and he divided them up into quartiles. He took these several hundred people, and he divided them up into 4 parts. Those that were the most pessimistic and least faith-filled, all the way up to those that were the most faith-filled and optimistic. And here is what he found. 90% of the most optimistic, faith-filled people were still alive at 85. 34% of the most negative and pessimistic were still alive at 85. If you want to increase your chance of living to 85 by 56% or 50, okay? All you got to do is be a positive, upbeat, faithful person. Another study was done. I'll get back to the right place here. Of 2,000 people over the age of 65. Okay? It was the largest study that's ever been done on this. And these people were located in the southwest United States. Here's what they found. That optimistic, faith-filled people they had better health habits. They had lower blood pressure. They had feistier immune systems, and they were half as likely to die. Okay? Half as likely to die. How many of you think that's good news? Raise your hands. Those of you that are not raising your hands are in serious trouble. Okay? It's kind of interesting. There were 12 spies sent out. Joshua and Caleb had faith. We can do it. Let's do it. The other 10 said, no, it can't be done. Let's go back and be slaves in Egypt. Anybody guess what happened to the other 10? They all died. They all died. None of them made it to Caleb's age at age 80. Not a one. Faith is such an amazing life giver. And there's all kinds of stories about this. There's a famous doctor. His name was Paul Brand, and he wrote a lot of faith-based books. And in fact, Philip Yancey said that Paul Brand, of all the people he ever met, was the one who impressed him the most. Well, Paul had a mom whose name was Evelyn Brand. Evelyn was a single young woman living in England, and she got the impression, the call, that she should go to India and be a missionary. And so she went as a young girl. She left India. She left England. She moved to India in 1909. Imagine what it took to do that in those days. 1909. When she was in India, she met a man named Jesse Brand, and they got married. And they started a ministry in rural India for the rural people of India. And they would provide medical supplies, they would teach, they built roads, they did all kinds of things. They went 7 years. 7 years as missionaries to India without winning a single Christian convert. Okay? 7 years. I'll tell you something. If I had gone, when I started ministry, if I had gone 7 years without a single baptism, I wouldn't be standing in front of you today. I would have been gone. Okay? 7 years. They went, not a single convert. And then in the little village where they were located, a priest from a non-Christian priest got sick, and he had a very high fever, and nobody in the village would come close to him. It was too dangerous. They felt he was too contagious. Evelyn and Jesse Brand nursed him while he was dying. And this non-Christian priest said, this God Jesus must be the one true God, because only Jesse and Evelyn would minister to me in my dying. He was so impressed with these two, he left his children to be wards of the Brands. And when that happened, all of a sudden the floodgates opened and people all around began to come to Christ. They had 13 more years of very successful ministry, and then Jesse died. Evelyn was 50 years old at this time, and everybody expected that Evelyn would go back home to England, but she didn't. She was kind of a feisty character, and she stayed another 20 years. Her son Paul came to see her when she was 70, and Paul, being a physician, wrote about aging, and looking at his mom, he came to this conclusion about how to grow old. Here's what he wrote. He said, allow everything else to fall away until those around you see only love. Let everything else go until all that's left of you is love. That's finishing well. That's wholehearted faith. The second thing you need, besides wholehearted faith, you need a challenge. You need a challenge. This is Caleb. Caleb says, so here I am, 85 years old. I am still as strong as the day that Moses sent me out. I'm just as vigorous to go out into battle now as I was then. Now give me this hill country that the Lord promised me that day. You yourself heard that. The Anakites were the ones and their cities were large and fortified, but the Lord helping me, I will drive them out just as he said. Question. Those of you that are military people, what's the hardest city to take? One out in the open plain or one that's fortified on top of a hill? One on top of the hill is way harder to take. What is Caleb saying? I'm 85 years old, but I'm going to go. Give me a challenge. Give me the hardest one. Give me the hill country. I'll go drive them out. God has promised me he would help me. Okay? Who's he facing? He's facing the Anakites. Remember what the spy said about the Anakites in Numbers? They said, we saw the descendants of Anakites. We seem like grasshoppers next to them. Anakites, that's the hill country. This guy, Caleb, 85 years old. You see, you think he would say, well, put me in a nice Christian retirement community, in Shalom Acres. No, that isn't what he says. He says, I want the privilege of a really hard assignment. He wants one more chance at the hill country. God, just give me the hill country. There's a researcher, Dr. Marion Diamond. She's a researcher at UC Berkeley, and she's one of the world's leading neuroanatomists. And one of the things she found out was that deliberately induced problems, challenges, are required literally to keep your brain healthy and developing. Okay? She's done a lot of work with rats. Okay? Dr. Diamond did. And one experiment was that she had rats in a cage and she would just give them food. They could have it whenever they wanted. Another group of rats, she put them in a cage. She gave them food, but between the food and the rat, there was some sort of obstacle. And the rat had to figure a way over, around, or through this obstacle in order to get to the food. They had to problem solve. And she found that the rats who had to problem solve developed thicker cortexes and more dendrites. They could navigate mazes more quickly. They were able to solve problems more efficiently. They were less likely to watch Dances with the Stars. The fewer problems the rat had, the faster its brain went downhill. So, if you love a rat, give them problems. A little bit unusual marriage advice. If you're married to a rat and you want them to live, give them problems. She writes this. She says, in terms of successful aging, it is not enough to continue activities in the same groove year after year with the same expenditure of mental and physical energy. The brain requires new challenges if it is to remain a healthy, functioning organ. Give me the hill country, God. God has wired us up. He has wired our bodies, our brains, our minds, and our spirits to require not comfort, not ease, not security, but a challenge. When I was pastoring the Banner Elk Church, I went to visit a church member one time, and I walked into his living room, and it was dark, and the church member was sitting here like this. And I said, hey, what's wrong with you? He says, they retired me at work. Oh, so what you going to do in your retirement? Nothing. They won't let me work. Well, don't you have any hobbies or anything? No, all I ever did was work. Made me mad. And I said to him, hey, buddy, Get off your behind and get to work. He says, you didn't listen to me, Pastor. They won't let me go to work. I said, I'm not talking about that kind of work. There's other things you can do. Well, what? I said, well, for one thing, your wife is a cripple down the hill in a nursing home. She can't feed herself. Get down there every day and feed her lunch and feed her supper. You'll get to spend time with your wife and you'll do some good. I says, your mom lives up the hill from you. She's 90 years old. She's been over double with osteoporosis. Her grass needs mowing and her hedges need trimming. Get up the hill and help your mom. Well, evidently he had never been a foreman or a boss, because when I gave him the pet talk, all of a sudden he said, you know what, Pastor? I'm going to do it. And he did. He went down the hill every day and he started feeding his wife twice a day. One time I drove by his house and he was walking up the street towards his mom. He had a rake in one hand and a garden hose over his shoulders. He did some good in his retirement to his aged wife. He did some good to his even older mother. And more than that, I'm sure I added 10 years of life to him because he had purpose now. We need challenges. We need new things. So, what do we need? To age well, we need a wholehearted faith. You need a challenge. And third, you need to be connected. You need to have some friendships. You need to have some people in your life, some relationships. Caleb was one of 2 faithful scouts. Joshua was the other one. Think about this. Joshua got to be the new Moses. When Moses died, Joshua got to be the leader. Caleb didn't. You ever thought about, I wonder how Caleb took that. I was as faithful as Joshua. How come he got the promotion? How come not me? He could have sulked. He could have withdrawn. He could have isolated himself. Instead, his engagement with his community and with the people of God just grew stronger. I mean, I never thought about this until this week, but you know the story. Caleb's generation, the generation that he had left Egypt with, all died. None of his contemporaries were left. So that means Caleb had to form a whole new series of friendships with a generation younger than him. He had to become friends with people younger. He had to become a mentor and a guide and a cheerleader to a new generation because all of his peers were gone. And he did this to such an extent that when Caleb went to the hill country, this younger generation says, hey, if he's going, we're going to go too, and we want Caleb to be our leader. You see, community is life-giving. Isolation is terminal. Dr. Diamond, that I've told you about, decided to see what the effects of isolation was. She found that when she put 12 rats together in the same cage, a little community of rats, and then she gave them a challenge, their brains developed more and thicker cortexes and so on than if they were given a challenge but put in a cage in isolation. Okay? She wanted to see how this worked with older rats. So she took rats that were 600 days old. Now, in human terms, 600 days for a rat is about 60 in human years. Okay? She took these older rats and she found out same results. No different from older rats than younger rats. She was invited to Germany to present her findings, and when she went there, though, she learned something. She found that her rats had begun to die after 600 days, but in Germany, the rats were living to 800 days. And she wondered, why? And so she asked them, and they told her, and she went back to her laboratory at UC Berkeley, and she told her lab assistants, there's one thing we have not been giving our rats, and now we are going to start. Not only are we going to put our rats in community with each other, not only are we going to give them challenges, now we are going to start giving our rats love. Every time a little rat negotiated his maze or his obstacle, the researcher would reach in and take the little rat and hold it up to its lab coat, and they would rub its little head and they would say, "Oh, nice little ratty, I love you. You're so sweet." And they would put it back in the cage. They started loving their rats. Not only did they break the 800-day barrier, their rats were still alive at 904 days. They were still developing thicker cortexes, more developed brains, challenging conditions, because community gives life. Isolation destroys it. That's part of God's plan for our church. The generations together, young and old, loving and receiving life, giving hope, receiving wisdom. That's God's plan, and we believe it's God's plan for the church. We want to be a place where everyone is welcome, regardless of age or background or tradition or ethnic group. A place where everyone can come and be loved. How key it is for older people to mentor younger people. But it is also important for younger people to acknowledge and prize and love older people. Sometimes as we age, we lose partners or children move away from home. And older people, don't give hugs. They don't get hugs. They don't get affectionate touch anymore. In fact, my wife works in the nursing home community, and one of the things they try to do is to hug the residents, because they don't get that very much. So in our church, you see an older person, give them a hug, give them a pat on the shoulder, tell them how much you appreciate them. And we can do that for each other. If you're a younger group and you have your little group of friends, every once in a while, invite an older person to come and allow them to mentor you and teach you and cheer you on. And if you're in an older group, every once in a while, invite a younger member to come and let them tell you what life is like for them, and then you cheer for them. It's such a cool deal. And of course, we can't make that happen. We can't have that kind of spirit on our own. But God can transform us. He can make us those kinds of people. This is from Isaiah. It's a fabulous text. "Listen to me, O house of Jacob, even to your old age and gray hairs. I am he who will sustain you. I have made you, and I will carry you, and I will sustain you, and I will rescue you." When somebody sees somebody finishing well, investing in younger people is just the best. What can God do with one person who is finishing well? I was telling you about Evelyn Brand. She reaches 70 years old, and Evelyn is known as Granny Brand. And the mission board says, "Well, Granny, you've given it a good shot. We're not going to renew your contract for another 5 years. You need to come home." And so Granny's contemporaries and her associates there in India, they give her a big farewell party. They give her a plaque. They tell her how much they appreciate her work. They wish her bon voyage home. And then they give Granny the floor, and she says, "I got a little secret. I'm not going home." She says, "I've always wanted," like Caleb, "I've always wanted to work with the people in the hill country of India. And I'm going to go up there." So Granny, she'd squirreled away little money. She built a shack up in the hill country. She bought a pony, and she would ride from one village to another. And she would tell people about the love of Jesus. When Granny was 75, her son comes to see her, and he says, "Man, Mom, you've had a good run. Surely it's time for you to come home." And she says, "No, I'm not going home. I want another mountain. God, give me another mountain." For the next 18 years, she traveled from one village to another on horseback. And it was rough going. And sometimes she fell off. She got several concussions. But finally now, she is 93 years old. She can't ride her pony anymore. And so for the next 2 years, the men of the village put Granny on a stretcher because they loved her. And they took her from one village to another on stretcher so she could tell people how much Jesus loved them. God, 93 years old, give me the hill country. See, folks, that's finishing well. Finishing well is not retiring comfortably. It is not a great 401k. It is not a healthy body. It is not security. Finishing well is, God, give me another mountain. When I was a boy, growing up in the Asheville church, there was an old retired minister there. His name was Elder Clark. And because I was just a kid, I didn't know too much about Elder Clark, except that I remember he had a head full of white hair. I also remember that Elder Clark could give some of the best testimonies about Jesus that I ever heard. We would have testimony services in those days, and he would get up and talk about Jesus, and it would just move my heart. And I remember one time he got up and he talked about the second coming and how he was old and how he longed to see Jesus come in the clouds of glory. And he talked about how he wanted to be alive, when those who live and remain would be able to see Christ coming in the clouds of glory. And he talked about it so beautifully that tears streamed down my 12-year-old face. And I bowed my head and I prayed, oh, Lord, please come so Elder Clark can see you come in the clouds of heaven. I wanted that for Elder Clark because he wanted it so badly. 12 years later, I work at the conference office. And the office right across the hall from mine was the Office of Trust Services. And the director of Trust Services, some of you are older may remember, was A.J. Skinder, Elder A.J. Skinder. And A.J. Skinder had been my pastor when I was 12 in the Asheville church. And one day, A.J. was in my office, and we were talking about a trust that had been set up by a church member with the conference. And so we talked about that a little bit. And when it was finished, I happened to think about it. I says, Elder Skinder, do you ever remember an old retired pastor in the Asheville church by the name of Elder Clark? And he said, oh, yeah. Johnny, let me tell you a story. He says it was a Monday, and I was going to have church board that night, and I had an item on the agenda that was just weighting me down. I didn't know how to handle it. I knew it might end my ministry, and I was just really concerned about it. And I thought about, I need some advice. And then he thought, well, who could I get advice from? Then he thought of Elder Clark, and he says, Elder Clark was the most spiritual man I knew. Elder Clark had been there and done that. I think I'll go talk to Elder Clark. So he got on the phone. He called Elder Clark's house to ask if he could come over to talk to him. And whoever answered the phone says, well, Pastor, Elder Clark is in the hospital at Mission Hospital. And Elder Skin said, oh, I didn't know that. So he got in a car and he drove up to Mission Hospital. He went up to Elder Clark's room, knocked on the door, went in, and he says, Elder Clark, I'm so sorry you're in the hospital. I didn't know till this morning you were there. And I know as your pastor I should be ministering to you because you're in the hospital. But I've got a problem, and I hope you can minister to me. And Elder Clark said, well, he kind of smiled, and he says, yeah, my angel told me you were coming. I've been expecting you. And that took Elder Skinder back just a little bit. And he says, well, here's my problem. And he went on and he told his problem. And when he was finished, Elder Clark said, well, My angel told me that was your problem, and I've been thinking about it all morning, and here's what I think you ought to do. And Elder Skinner said that when he heard Elder Clark's advice, he just knew that was God speaking directly to him through Elder Clark. And he says, Elder Clark, I'm going to do exactly as you advise. Now, because I'm your pastor and you're in the hospital, I ought to be ministering to you. So I am going to pray that God will heal you and you'll be back in church on Sabbath. And Elder Clark says, well, I can always use the prayer, but my angel told me that I'm not going to live long. But I shouldn't worry because Jesus will be with me when I die. But Elder Skinner prayed anyway. He says, I'm going to pray for a better outcome than that. I'm going to pray that God heals you and you'll be at church on Sabbath. And so he prayed for him and he went home, and that night he went to the board meeting. And when that item on the agenda came up that he was so worried about, he said, he did what Elder Clark said, and it just resolved. It just went smoothly and wonderful. And he went home with this burden off of his shoulders, and he got a good night's sleep. When he woke up the next morning, he said, I ought to go back and tell Elder Clark how well the board meeting went and thank him for his good advice. So he gets in his car. He drives back over to Mission Hospital. He goes up to Elder Clark's room, knocks on the door, goes in, and the room is empty. And the bed is all made. And he thinks, well, maybe he's down having a test done, or maybe they moved him to another room. So he walks down to the nurse's station, and he says, I'm A.J. Skinner. I'm the Elder Clark's pastor, and I wondered, he's not in his room. Is he getting a treatment, or have you moved him to another room? And the nurse says, well, Pastor, I'm sorry to tell you, Elder Clark died last night. And A.J. said, well, I'm sorry to hear that. I didn't know. And he turns to walk away, and the nurse says, it was kind of unusual. Kind of unusual. And A.J. turns around to the nurse, and she says, I'm the one who found him. When I came on my shift this morning and was making rounds, I found him. And what was strange was his legs and his hips were in the bed. But his head was leaning over and laying in the chair next to the bed like it was in somebody's lap. And Elder Skinner said to me, he says, Johnny, I always believed that Elder Clark died with his head in Jesus' lap. Little Creek, you have started strong. Now finish well.